Welcome back, everyone. Is morality universal? Is it merely relative to individuals or cultures? That's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start with the idea that ethics is relative to cultures. Not surprisingly, this is called cultural relativism. And a lot of people who are new to the study of philosophy, they tend to gravitate toward this moral philosophy, this idea of cultural relativism. And it's not surprising why, because of the diversity in cultural mores and moral rules that seemingly differ from place to place, time to time. Take for example, what should be done, morally speaking, with bodies after we die? Some of you might want to be buried, some of you might want to be cremated. Cremation was the norm in ancient Greek society, but in other societies, namely the Galatians, the cultural norm was to consume the dead bodies of the people who had passed. Now, that seems maybe grotesque to a lot of you, but if we grew up in that time, in that culture, we probably would find it morally acceptable. So maybe that's the end of the story. Because we see variations in moral rules from different places, different cultures, different times, different eras, that must mean that there are no rules that are completely universal. Well, that's not quite the end of the story. It might be that even if some rules vary from place to place or time to time, there still might be a handful, there still might be a lot of rules that are ubiquitous across all cultures. I mean, for instance, a rule against rampant dishonesty. If you were allowed to lie and be dishonest and deceitful whenever you wanted, it doesn't seem like society would function very well. Or how about a rule about taking care of children, or making sure the next generation survives, or no child abuse, or no child neglect, something like that. If you didn't have that rule, then society might last, but just not for very long. And how about a rule against murder or genocide, or harming or hurting people for fun or for no good reason? It seems like without rules like these, society would just collapse. It would just be a matter of time. And so just because there may be some variation in some rules, it doesn't mean that there are no rules that are universal. There still might be some. So that's a case for some sort of universality when it comes to ethics. Now, what about the idea that some advance that morality is objective? That there are moral rules, perhaps even moral facts, that are akin to natural facts, or maybe akin to facts or laws or axioms, we might call them, in logic or mathematics. A lot of philosophers gravitate toward this idea. Disciples of Plato tend to be moral realists. Sometimes they're called moral Platonists. Platonists, or these realists, they tend to think that morality isn't just willy-nilly, doesn't just vary from place to place or, gosh forbid, person to person. There's just got to be something deeper than that. Morality it's got to be objective. It can't be contingent or depend upon any one person or any one group's moral attitudes, feelings, beliefs, or culture. So if you agree with that, then you can count yourself as a moral objectivist, which philosophers sometimes call moral realism. It's the idea that morals are real and not just connected to cultural or individual attitudes about morality. Let's draw an analogy to the sciences. There are facts that the scientific community seem to discover, right? So I got some water right here. And while humans have been aware of this substance, probably for all of our existence, I would wager, we didn't know the chemical composition of water. We didn't know about molecules and the atoms that make them up. We didn't know that water contains hydrogen and it contains oxygen, right? H2O. 2 parts hydrogen for 1 part oxygen. And you can map out, you can draw out the structure of the molecules like you might do in a general science or chemistry class. And the oxygen molecule is much bigger because it's a heavier element. But we didn't know all of this until science progressed far enough. So there seem to be chemical facts about water as a substance. Water chemically is H2O. And that's a fact. Does that depend on how humans feel about water or what cultures do with water? No. And that's because the fact is an objective one. It's independent of those sorts of things. Now, what about an analogy to mathematics? Well, truths or axioms or arithmetic principles, 2 plus 2 equals 4, 7 plus 5 equals 12, 3 times 6 equals 18. These are just spouting off the top of my head. Those mathematical expressions seem to express some sort of truth, perhaps some sort of mathematical fact, if there is such a thing. But the truth of those sorts of things, so I gave some arithmetic examples. We could give some logical ones. There's a law in logic called the principle of non-contradiction, which states that take some proposition, call it A or P. It's not the case that P and not P. So if P stood for, I don't know, water is H2O, then not P would be water isn't H2O. So even before humans figured out the chemical composition of water, if someone were to say it's H2O and it's not H2O, that belief or that proposition that they're expressing with their language would be false. So all contradictions are false. It's another way of thinking about it. So that's a true proposition in logic, and perhaps it's a logical fact. Okay, so I gave you an example of an objective fact in science that seems to be more appropriate in science, and then maybe we'll say a logical truth. We have to be careful with talking about objectivity in logic. But setting that aside, some philosophers think that there are moral facts or moral truths, just like there are chemical facts, biological facts, physical facts, and there are logical facts or truths. So just like 2 plus 2 equals 4 or water is H2O, perhaps we could add to that list of things that are objectively so, or statements that are true. We could add lying is wrong, slavery is wrong, charity is good, helping others is good, taking care of the next generation is morally good. So maybe morality is objective, and those are some examples to get you to understand why that might be. So that's it for the moral realists and moral objectivists. Now, what about those who disagree with that? Do they exist? Certainly. And some of them are cultural relativists. So they don't buy this idea of objectivity and morality. So you might reject relativism when it comes to scientific facts or facts from the natural world or natural domain. You might say, science is one thing, but ethics and morality, that's something else. It's just very, very different. And To say otherwise is a bit too arrogant. It would be like if one person or one group, it would be like them imposing their personal or their culture's morality onto everyone else. There's something sort of arrogant. There's some arrogance about that, isn't there? So maybe that sounds sensible to you, maybe it doesn't, but let's understand the view. So one way to differentiate these different big ideas when it comes to morality is to think about them in terms of language. How would a moral objectivist and a cultural relativist, how would they interpret an utterance like, say, slavery is wrong? Well, a moral objectivist might say that utterance expresses a belief or a statement or proposition, and that belief or statement is true, and what makes that belief or proposition true is the way the world is independently of human beings, is some objective fact. Philosophers that get really technical about language will talk about truths, things that can be true or that can bear truth. So like a belief can be true. You could say, that belief you have, that's true. Or what you believe is wrong, it's false. And statements. So a lot of the things that we say express statements, which some philosophers of language will sometimes call propositions. So I'll go back and forth. Statement, proposition. These are what are expressed by some of the things that we say, particularly our declarative sentences. So there's a relationship between beliefs and statements. And one of the things that they have in common is that presumably they can both be true. So I believe water's H2O. You probably believe it too. And I just uttered a declarative sentence. I just said it, water's H2O. So I have the belief, and that belief is true. And I uttered the words, and that was a sentence, and that sentence expresses a statement, and that happens to be true. So what makes those true things true? Well, philosophers have come up with a technical word, truth makers. So you've got things like beliefs, and you have things like statements that are sometimes classified as truth. This is a lot of technical lingo, so I get that. But I'd say it's kind of fun to think about. So you have beliefs and statements. These are truth bearers, says these philosophers, because they can be, they can bear, they can have truth. And then they stand in relationship to truth makers. These are the things that, of course, make a belief or a proposition true. And so what are examples of truth makers? Well, facts, objective facts, facts that are the way the world shows up, the way it is. Reality maybe is just a cluster of facts. It's the way it is, the way the world shows up. And sometimes we as humans do things as individuals or as cultures or societies that impact the world. We do all sorts of things. And so sometimes the way the world is depends on what we think, what we do, what we decide, what we feel. Sure. So anything that is socially constructed is going to be tied to society and to human beings. But presumably, there's a lot of the world that is doing its thing, if you will, independently of anything social or anything human. So I don't know. What's going on physically, chemically, in other star systems, so think about Star Wars, a galaxy far, far away, right? And forget any of the sentient beings there. Go to a galaxy that's lifeless, and so what's there? Well, presumably a bunch of stars and planets, probably, and I don't know, comets and asteroids and a bunch of other stellar phenomena. But there's a bunch of we don't know about these things, but there are a bunch of facts about that galaxy. At least presumably, they're out there, if you will. We just haven't put our discovery, like our telescopes and our epistemological light, our spotlight, if you will, on them. So we don't know about them. But for people who are realists, scientific realists, they'll say, yeah, that's out there. It's doing its thing. And there's a fact about those galaxies and the things that make it up. So they're truth makers out there. Okay, so what does this have to do with moral relativism and cultural relativism? Well, the truth maker for the true statements or true beliefs for a moral realist are going to be facts that are independent of human beings, that are mind independent. Philosophers of mind, philosophers who do metaphysics, they will often use this term, mind independent. So that's to refer to things in the world that exist and their nature doesn't depend, doesn't hinge, isn't contingent upon any human thinking, any feeling, any human attitude, any social factor, kind of like the stellar phenomena of the planets and comets and asteroids of the galaxy far, far away. Now, for cultural relativism, it's a little bit of a different story. So there's still room for truth for cultural relativists, because if I'm a cultural relativist, I could utter the words, slavery is wrong, and those words could express my belief that it's wrong, and it could express the proposition that slavery is wrong, and that belief and that proposition can be true, but here's the gist. But what makes that belief and statement true, it's not a mind-independent fact about the world. It is a fact about my culture. So that's what grounds morality for the relativists. It's going to be a fact about one's culture. And it will be the fact that my culture disapproves of slavery. But for the moral realist, there's a fact there, but it's a mind-independent fact. So this is kind of tricky, because most people, before they take a philosophy class, they tend to think of facts as all the same. Facts are the way it is, and like you can't argue with the facts, or your thoughts and feelings have no impact on factual matters. And when we're talking about these objective facts, that's true. I mean, think about it in the case of water. No matter how much feeling I have, or kind of how much I try to use my mind power and my beliefs, I'm not going to change the chemical composition of water. It's going to remain 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, H2O. And that's certainly the case with, say, the mass of some random planet in some random galaxy. My thoughts and feelings, or even collectively, the thoughts and feelings and attitudes of humanity have no bearing on the mass of that planet. There's a fact about that planet, and that fact does not depend on us, so it's a mind-independent fact. However, the fact that a certain culture approves or hopefully disapproves of slavery, that is also a fact, right? Cultures have certain moral preferences, or seemingly they do, right? So, for example, our culture today does not have a preference for slavery, thank goodness. And unfortunately, cultures of the past found it morally acceptable in some cases. And that's also a fact, isn't it? So that's the point that I'm trying to get across, is that some facts are tied or connected to us. Does that make sense? I hope it does. And some aren't. Different classes of facts. And so for cultural relativists, morality is grounded in facts. It's just those facts are human facts. They're mind-dependent facts. They're culturally dependent facts. And for moral objectivists or moral realists, it's also grounded in facts, but mind-independent facts. So think again about this in terms of moral sentences. So what's the definition of a moral sentence? Well, it's not just any ordinary sentence. It's a sentence that contains moral language. So it contains words like morally good, morally bad, morally right, morally wrong, justice, morally acceptable, morally permissible. Any bits of language that are loaded or laden with an ethical or moral component. Now that's not the best definition, because there's probably some circularity in there. But I think you can at least start to wrap your head around it, what I'm trying to get at. So slavery is wrong, morally speaking. That's a moral sentence. You say water's H2O, that's not a moral sentence. There are 4 chairs around the table. That's not a moral sentence. Being a dishonest person is not morally acceptable. That is a moral sentence. So hopefully you get the idea. How do these different views interpret these moral sentences? A moral realist or moral objectivist, they will ground the belief, the true belief or the true statement. They will ground it in an ethical fact that is mind independent. However, the cultural relativists will ground it in a fact that is mind dependent. And that fact might be something like, my culture disapproves of slavery. Okay, let's get even more relativistic. So, morality is not relative. That's moral objectivism or moral realism. Morality is relative to cultures. That's cultural relativism. What if morality is relative? Sorry if I said relevant. Is relative to the individual. So this is an extreme form of moral relativism. Morality doesn't just vary from culture to culture. It varies from person to person. So like I said before, you have your morality, I have mine, and that's the end of the story. no one person's morality is morally superior to anyone else's in any profound sense. So this view is moral subjectivism or ethical subjectivism. And so again, let's think about it in terms of language and sentences. So the sentence slavery is wrong, again, for the moral realists, that is tied to an objective fact that slavery is wrong. The cultural relativist, they'll look at the moral sentence slavery is wrong, and that's grounded not in an objective fact, but in a cultural fact. And for the subjectivist, an utterance like slavery is wrong, that's also tied to a fact, but it's an individual fact. It's tied to the fact that the individual in question has this belief or has this attitude, or it's a fact that they say or they believe that slavery is wrong, or they disapprove of slavery. All three of these moral schools of thought, moral realism, cultural relativism, and subjectivism, there's room for truth and moral facts in all three of them. And because of this, all three of those groups fall under the umbrella of a view called cognitivism, moral cognitivism. Loosely, it's the view that there's room for truth in ethics. More technically, it's the view that moral sentences express propositions and beliefs that can be true, that are truth apt. So I'll say that again. Loosely, it's the idea that there's room for truth in ethics. And you might be thinking, why is it called cognitivism? So I mentioned this in another video. Well, the word cog and cognition, which is related to thinking, think of the different aspects of our mind. There's the thinking, logical, analytic, cognitive side that's connected very intimately or houses things like beliefs, which can be true. And then there's the side that is passionate, passional, sentimental, related to gut feelings, intuition, and desire. And so, because truth is related to belief, which is related to thinking, cognition, that's probably the reason for the name. But again, loosely, it's the idea that there's room for truth in ethics. There are ethical truths. And then there are some who reject this idea. They reject cognitivism and they say, you know what? Ethics, it's not really about truth and falsity. It's more about desire and feeling. So the proponents of that view who reject cognitivism are called non-cognitivists. So what's non-cognitivism? Well, loosely, it's the idea that there's no room for truth or belief in morality. And if you think you have a moral belief, you are mistaken, which would be a surprise because it certainly seems, at least to me and probably to you, like among my beliefs about the world, some of them are beliefs about moral issues, like dishonesty, generally speaking, is a morally bad thing. I mean, I think I believe that, but some in this camp would say I'm mistaken. Technically, non-cognitivism is the view that while there are moral sentences, like if I say slavery is wrong, hey, look, I uttered a moral sentence, so you'd be hard-pressed to deny the existence of moral sentences. It's just they're going to go as so far as to say that those moral sentences, they do not express propositions and beliefs, the sorts of things that are truth apt. And instead, they express sentiments or feelings or perhaps commands. So again, I invite you to think about our moral sentence in question. Slavery is wrong. How is that interpreted by all these different views? So we've looked at the interpretation of 3 of the views, but what about on the non-cognitivist side? Well, there's lots of different versions of non-cognitivism, but one of the ones that became popular in the 20th century was called Emotivism. And so for emotivists, if you say slavery is wrong, you're not really expressing a belief or some statement that's true, that's connected to some moral fact. Instead, you're expressing your feelings, your attitude, your where your heart is, where your emotions are at when it comes to slavery. You're expressing your feelings about it. And so instead of the sentence connecting to a statement, emotivists will go so far as to say it's better to think of these sentences as expressing exclamations. So if you're at a concert or a sporting event and you cheer, yay, hurrah, or you jeer, or you boo, your team is losing or your team scores, yay. So, there could be a transcript of all the cheering and booing that you did at some sporting event, and that transcript would contain many sentences, right? Would those sentences express statements? Well, not the yays and the boos. Those are exclamations. So either our exclamations or the express exclamations, and it's tied to your emotions, right? This is kind of how we express our feelings, is when we exclaim. And so for these emotivists, some of the big names in America, Charles Stevenson; in England, A.J. Ayer, they thought that's kind of what's going on with morality. That's what's going on with morality. When we talk about ethics, it's not about beliefs and truth, it's just expressing our feelings. And then there was this other non-cognitivist. His last name was Hare. And he agreed with the emotivists that these utterances, we shouldn't tie them to beliefs and truth and facts. Instead, they are commands or expressions of commands. So if you recorded a parent to a child, who was reprimanding them for, misbehaving, the parent might say things like, don't touch that. Do what I say. Take out the trash. Stop kicking your brother. Okay, and you read the transcript and there'd be a bunch of sentences, right? Well, would those sentences express statements? Would they express propositions that are, true or false? No. Those weren't declarative sentences. Those were imperatives. Those were commands. And they just function differently than declarative sentences. And someone like Hare thought that that's what morality is doing, that these are commands or prescriptions. So he was endorsing a view called prescriptivism. So it's the idea that, or here's an example of it. Take our sample sentence, slavery is wrong. The way we ought to interpret that is as a command. So someone utters the words, slavery is wrong, and what they're doing is, it's like they're issuing a command, which would be something like, slavery, don't do that, don't enslave other people, other human beings. And it's still a rejection of cognitivism, because these aren't beliefs. There's no moral facts. There's no true propositions. But it's a little bit different from emotivism, because we're not talking about exclamations. We're not tying our sentences, moral utterances, to exclamations. Instead, we're tying them to commands. Okay, that was a lot, and this got really, really technical, and some of you are getting a little window into some of the jargon and how precise and how technical some styles of analytic philosophy, how they can be. And some people, they're off-put by this, but hey, I'm biased, but I just think it's kind of cool to get everything, to really think deeply about these things and really get down to the nuts and bolts and get really detail-oriented and make sure we're all on the same page. And so the good news is that, most of the things we do don't get to this level of precision and don't get so technical. But I think it's good to do this sometimes. All right, that's all I have for you. Thanks for hanging out with me.